First contact with the unthinkable. The Galactic Confederacy had prepared for nearly every conceivable first contact scenario. Over its long history, the Confederacy's diplomatic corps had meticulously documented 27,614 protocols to handle interstellar relations. But not a single one of them addressed what to do when a species willingly destroyed its own embassy, with hostages still inside. Ambassador Zacatrol's translucent membranes fluttered in distress. The holographic display in front of him showed a live feed of the smoldering ruins where the human embassy on Centauri Prime had once stood. The once grand structure, a shining symbol of diplomatic cooperation, was now a blackened crater. "They what?" Zacatrol's voice crackled with disbelief. His aide, a six-limbed Venturi named Cicatrol, shifted nervously, the tips of his appendages twitching in anxiety. "They detonated their own embassy, sir," he repeated, with the hostage-takers still inside. A stunned silence spread across the emergency council chamber. Then, chaos erupted. Clicking mandibles, whistling vocal cords, reverberating chest sacs. The languages of 24 species filled the vast hall as representatives from across the galaxy struggled to process what they had just witnessed. The axolotl delegate excreted stress pheromones, causing the Proxima Collective's bioluminescent diplomats to recoil in disgust. The situation was deteriorating fast. But those were their own people, sputtered Tanel of the Proxima Collective, his skin flashing erratic distress patterns. "Yes," confirmed High Commander Vex of the Orion Security Forces, the only one who seemed completely unfazed. She adjusted the grip on her data tablet before adding, "And that's exactly what makes this so." She paused, as if searching for the correct translation, then smirked slightly. "Human. The problem with humans." The truth was, ever since humanity had achieved faster-than-light FTL travel 73 years ago, they had been a galactic headache. Most civilizations took centuries to carefully nurture their scientific advancements, refining each technological leap with meticulous precision. Humans? They looked at the laws of physics, declared them suggestions, and then duct-taped together a warp drive. Their reckless ingenuity had caused 17 different species theoretical physicists to develop drinking problems, and their approach to diplomacy? Equally baffling. The emergency council chamber fell into silence as Cicatrol activated another hologram. A stern-faced human, calm despite the destruction around him, flickered into view. He wore the uniform of the Terran Diplomatic Corps, his insignia gleaming in the artificial light. The message began in that peculiar, formal yet casual way humans often spoke. "To whom it may concern," the human ambassador stated. "If you're watching this, our embassy has been destroyed, along with everyone inside. The terrorists demanded that we release their comrades from our detention facilities and provide them safe passage." A slight pause. Their demands were denied. The ambassador's expression hardened. "Let this serve as a galactic notice. Humans do not negotiate with terrorists, ever, under any circumstances. Not even to save our own people. Especially not to save our own people." A hushed stillness overtook the chamber. The cost of giving in to such demands creates incentives for more terrorism, endangering countless lives in the future. This is a mathematical certainty, one we have calculated many times throughout our history. We choose to sacrifice the few to protect the many. A subtle, almost amused smile touched his lips. This is not a negotiable position. The message ended, and the room remained utterly still. The cerulean representative, a translucent-skinned being with 3 visible hearts, was the first to speak. They They sacrificed themselves? Not exactly, Commander Vex interjected, studying the report on her tablet. Our intelligence scans detected no human life signs inside the embassy at the time of detonation. Only the 15 terrorist operatives. A long pause followed. Then Trinell, a reptilian diplomat from the Andorian hegemony, spoke, voice laced with disbelief. So, they tricked the terrorists into thinking they had hostages? Yes, Vex confirmed, her facial ridges twitching, the Orion equivalent of a smirk. They manipulated their enemies' assumptions and then broadcasted a message ensuring no terrorist group in the galaxy would ever attempt this again. Another stunned silence. But that's barbaric, whispered the axolotl representative, his stress pheromones thick in the air. Vex exhaled, shaking her head. No, she corrected, tapping the side of her datapad. That's game theory. The Confederacy responds with panic and outrage. The emergency session of the Galactic Security Council had been in progress for 12 straight hours, and it showed no signs of ending. Representatives from 47 species filled the vast, tiered chamber, their overlapping voices forming a tangled mess of alien languages. Chitters, guttural growls, harmonic vibrations, and even biochemical scent emissions. The sheer chaos in the room was unparalleled in Confederacy history. The destruction of the human embassy on Centauri Prime had shaken the political order to its core. Not because a terrorist attack had occurred. Those were, unfortunately, a fact of life, even in the vast, semi-utopian order of the Confederacy. No, the real shock was the human response. They destroyed their own diplomatic facility, hissed the Rigelian ambassador, his dark, chitinous shell vibrating with frustration. On purpose, this violates at least 17 Confederacy diplomatic statutes. And killed every last terrorist inside, the Andorian representative added, her scaled snout wrinkling. Without negotiation, without compromise. That is not how civilized species operate. The issue isn't just that they refused to negotiate, interrupted High Commander Vex, standing near the chamber's center. She was the only military official present among the sea of politicians and diplomats, and her sharp uniform contrasted starkly with the flowing ceremonial robes and draped sashes of her counterparts. She turned toward the assembled representatives, her dark gaze scanning the room. The issue is that humans didn't just retaliate. They calculated this response in advance. They had escape routes planned. They manipulated their enemies' expectations, and then they broadcasted a message that ensured no terrorist group would ever see them as viable hostages again. She let the weight of her words sink in before finishing. This was not a reaction. This was policy. A shudder rippled through the chamber. Even the most hardened diplomats were struggling with the implications. The nature of humanity, a dangerous revelation. Humans had been part of the Galactic Confederacy for just over 70 years, a blink of an eye in interstellar terms. They had joined as relative newcomers, still shaking off the aftermath of their own internal conflicts. Most species, when they first reached the stars, spent centuries developing a cautious, methodical approach to diplomacy. Not humans. Humans had a habit of rewriting the rulebook. They did it with science, where their reckless approach to physics had led to faster-than-light travel centuries before most experts thought possible. They did it with warfare, where they fought with an unsettling mix of ferocity and precision, never striking first, but ensuring that if they struck back, their enemies would regret ever lifting a weapon. And, as it turned out, they did it with diplomacy. The last stand of the Draconis separatists. The terrorist group responsible for the Centauri Prime attack, known as the Draconis Separatist Movement, DSM, had been active for nearly 2 decades. They had raided shipping lanes, bombed diplomatic envoys, assassinated political figures. Confederacy military forces had spent years trying to root them out, and failed. No amount of counterinsurgency efforts, no negotiations, no peace offerings had worked. The DSM was resilient, well-funded, and ruthless. And yet, 3 days after the destruction of the human embassy, they dissolved completely. Reports flooded in. High-ranking DSM officials turned themselves in to Confederacy authorities. Terrorist cells abandoned their posts, fleeing to distant systems. Known financial backers of the movement suddenly cut all ties, liquidating assets overnight. The entire movement collapsed because they had watched what humanity had done. They had seen the cold, merciless logic behind the human response, and they understood something no species had ever demonstrated before. Taking humans hostage was not just futile, it was a death sentence. The war of words. You expect us to accept this barbaric doctrine as valid policy? Grand Arbiter Shizel, a towering Lasuscan diplomat with thick, overlapping plates of armored skin, leaned forward on his podium, his deep voice booming across the chamber. The human ambassador, the same one who had issued the chilling message before the embassy's destruction, remained calm. I expect you to acknowledge reality, Arbiter, the human said smoothly. The Confederacy has spent 2 decades trying to solve the DSM problem. We solved it in 3 days. A ripple of uneasy murmurs spread through the chamber. Through brute force, spat the Rigelian delegate. Through clarity, corrected the human. The chamber quieted. Let's be precise. The human continued, clasping their hands together. We did not kill civilians. We did not flatten entire cities. We did not launch indiscriminate strikes. We calculated the exact pressure point needed to end this threat, and we applied it. But at what cost? The Andorian representative pressed. The human tilted their head slightly. 17 hostages were taken. We evacuated all of them before the attack. The only people who died were the 15 terrorists. The real question you should be asking isn't about the cost, it's about the efficiency. That statement sent a chill through the room. The implications and the fear. For most of galactic history, violence was a last resort in diplomacy. Humans did not see it that way. They did not see force as separate from negotiation. To them, violence was merely another tool in the arsenal of diplomacy, one that had to be applied correctly, precisely, and without hesitation. It was a terrifying revelation. Humans had contingency plans for their contingency plans. They had calculated responses to worst-case scenarios before those scenarios even happened. And, perhaps most disturbingly of all, it worked. No one could argue with the results. The DSM was gone. No further hostage situations had occurred. Terrorist organizations across the galaxy were re-evaluating their entire approach to dealing with humans. And in the back of every ambassador's mind, one thought lingered. What happens if we ever end up on the wrong side of humanity? A new era begins. 2 weeks later, High Commander Vex met with the human ambassador in a hastily repurposed maintenance facility, now serving as the temporary human embassy. You realize, Vex said carefully, that your actions violated 17 diplomatic statutes? The human smiled, not an expression of amusement, but something sharper. Actually, they corrected, sliding a data crystal across the table. We violated exactly 11 statutes, skirted the edge on 3 more, and found creative interpretations for the remaining ones. Vex blinked. You Counted? We always count, the human replied smoothly. Vex hesitated, looking at the crystal in front of her. She had a bad feeling about what it contained. Then she looked back at the human and asked the question she had been dreading. What exactly are you planning next? The human leaned forward, voice quiet but absolute. We're making sure this never happens again. Humanity's real plan unfolds. High Commander Vex sat stiffly across from the human ambassador, the data crystal resting between them like an unexploded mine. She hadn't touched it yet, but she knew that whatever was inside would change the course of interstellar politics forever. Humans were terrifyingly good at two things: breaking the rules in ways no one saw coming, winning, and judging by the unread crystal, they had just done both. Vex exhaled slowly. What's on it? The human leaned back, entirely too relaxed. That depends. Do you want the official answer or the real one? Vex's mandibles twitched. Let's start with official. The human nodded. Inside, you'll find a legal briefing prepared by our diplomatic and military divisions. It outlines precisely how our response on Centauri Prime complied with Confederacy regulations, despite what some representatives may claim. We've included case studies, historical precedents from 17 species, and a thorough deconstruction of Article 7, subsection 12 of the Galactic Diplomatic Accords, which Vex raised a hand. Enough. She rubbed her temple ridges, suddenly feeling the weight of the last 2 weeks pressing down on her. Now the real answer. The human's expression didn't change, but something behind their eyes shifted. There are 3 additional sections in that crystal. Their voice was measured too even. One is an intelligence analysis on the organizations that financially supported the Draconist separatist movement. Names, banking records, off-world transactions, all classified until now. Vex's blood ran cold. The human ambassador tapped the crystal lightly. Another section contains security vulnerabilities in the Confederacy's own diplomatic facilities across 47 planets. Vex's claws curled against the table. You analyzed our security? Of course. The human said it like it was obvious. You think we'd be reckless enough to assume Centauri Prime was the only soft target? Every human embassy has been running counterintelligence operations since the day we joined the Confederacy. Vex had suspected something like this, but hearing it confirmed still sent an icy wave of unease through her. The third section, the human continued, now watching her carefully, contains recommendations for fixing those vulnerabilities. That threw her. Fixing them? A shrug. Consider it a gift. If the Confederacy truly values diplomacy, it should ensure an incident like Centauri Prime never happens again. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Vex leaned forward, eyes narrowing. You did all this before the attack even happened, didn't you? The human ambassador smiled. You're starting to understand us, Commander. Fear, power, and the human mindset. 2 days later, the data crystal was in the hands of Grand Arbiter Shizel, the most powerful political figure in the Confederacy. He did not like what he was reading. Each section was worse than the last. Financial records proving that certain neutral nations had been quietly funding terrorist organizations. Maps and schematics exposing catastrophic flaws in Confederacy security infrastructure. Recommendations, not demands, just recommendations on how to fix those flaws. And beneath it all, a clear, unspoken message. Humans don't start fights, but they do finish them. Shizel sat back in his massive high-backed chair, exhaling deeply. The problem with humans wasn't their violence. The problem was that they thought about violence differently. Most species treated it as a failure of diplomacy. Humans treated it as a natural extension of diplomacy. And worse, they were good at it. Giselle activated the secure channel that connected him to his inner council, summoned the Confederacy's highest-ranking diplomats and security officials, he said gravely. We need to have a conversation about the human question. The meeting that changed the Confederacy forever. The Galactic Security Council met in absolute secrecy. No press, no recordings, only trusted individuals in the room. Representatives from the largest and most influential species gathered around the towering circular table. At the head sat Giselle, his 4 eyes scanning the assembled leaders. We have 3 options, he began. Sanction humanity, declare their actions illegal, and attempt to rein them in diplomatically. Expel them from the Confederacy, force them into isolation, refusing to acknowledge their government. Adapt. The first option was dismissed immediately. Sanctions wouldn't work. Humans were already too independent, already had strong alliances outside the Confederacy. Cutting them off would only make them more unpredictable. The second option was terrifying, because if the Confederacy banished humanity, there was one undeniable risk. They might win anyway. Humans were too resourceful, too calculating, too dangerous. If they were forced into exile, what happened when they came back? That left only the third option. High Commander Vex leaned forward. We don't have a choice, she admitted. We have to rethink our security policies, not just because of what happened, because of what could happen in the future. A grim murmur spread through the room. Giselle drummed his claws against the table. If we adapt, we're acknowledging that humanity's model works. Silence. Then the Andorian delegate, one of the most vocal critics of humanity, spoke softly. It does work. Another pause. Then one by one the others nodded. The aftermath. A new galactic order. 6 months later, the Confederacy quietly overhauled its security infrastructure. Every diplomatic facility received new emergency protocols. Every security agency adopted tighter intelligence measures. Every counterterrorism division restructured their policies. But the biggest shift was psychological. For the first time in history, the galaxy truly understood humanity's place in the cosmos. They weren't just another species. They weren't unpredictable outliers. They were something far more dangerous. They were planners. They anticipated worst-case scenarios. They prepared for every possibility. They turned chaos into calculation. And most importantly, they did not hesitate. A final conversation. Standing on the observation deck of a newly rebuilt human embassy, Vex found herself next to the human ambassador once again. You've changed the galaxy, she admitted. The human gave a small smile. The galaxy needed changing. Vex hesitated, then asked something that had been bothering her since the beginning. Do you actually believe what you said in your broadcast? That you would sacrifice your own people if necessary? The human didn't answer right away. They simply stared out at the vastness of space. Then, in a voice almost too soft to hear, they murmured, "We never have to." And that, Vex realized, was the real power of humanity. They didn't just refuse to negotiate with terrorists. They made terrorism a mathematically losing proposition. The final lesson. A challenge to humanity's resolve. The galaxy had changed. Not all at once, not in a grand, dramatic upheaval, but in small, quiet shifts, the kind that mattered. The Confederacy's security policies had been rewritten, diplomatic strategies reevaluated, and military doctrines altered. No one publicly admitted that these changes were inspired by humanity's actions on Centauri Prime, but everyone knew. The rules of engagement had been rewritten. And for a while, that was enough. Until someone inevitably decided to test humanity's resolve. A dangerous miscalculation. The Vashon Dominion was an empire of raiders. Not a government, not a civilization, but a plague. Their fleets preyed on the outer worlds of the Confederacy, striking from uncharted systems and vanishing before retaliation could arrive. For years, the Confederacy had tried diplomatic negotiations, offering treaties, concessions, and agreements. The Vashon had accepted none of them. They saw diplomacy as weakness, and so they made a fatal mistake. They took humans as prisoners. The message. The broadcast came 2 days later. A Vashon warlord, his chitinous exoskeleton gleaming under harsh lighting, stood in a dimly lit chamber. Behind him, 5 humans, captured Terran engineers and traders, were bound, restrained, and visibly injured. The warlord's voice was calm, measured. The Confederacy has failed to contain humanity's arrogance. You claim that your people do not negotiate with terrorists. We are not terrorists. We are warriors. We will teach you what war truly means. He tilted his head, mandibles clicking. You have 3 days to withdraw from contested space and acknowledge Vashon sovereignty over the outer colonies. If you refuse, these humans will die, and we will take more. The message ended abruptly. The galactic community held its breath. Would the humans bend? Would they make an exception? Would they finally, just once, negotiate? The answer came 5 hours later, and it was worse than anyone imagined. The human response. The second broadcast was from the Terran Diplomatic Corps. It was shorter than the Vashon message, much shorter. The human ambassador sat at a desk, utterly calm. To the Vashon Dominion, we do not negotiate, ever. They leaned forward slightly. But we do calculate. The transmission cut out, and the war began. The wrath of a calculating species. The Vashon expected a fight. What they got was extermination-level precision warfare. Humanity didn't just send warships, they sent data. Every Vashon trade route was compromised, every supply chain was severed, every encrypted network was infiltrated. The humans didn't fight the Vashon's war. They fought their own war. They destabilized the entire Dominion economy in 3 weeks. They sabotaged dozens of hidden military installations. They hunted every Vashon warlord with surgical precision. There were no grand battles, only disappearances, collapses, and silences. The Vashon's once mighty fleets found themselves trapped, isolated, and without reinforcements. And then, in the dead of night, the final message arrived. The last transmission. The remaining Vashon warlords, the last survivors of a collapsing empire, gathered in a desperate war council. Then their hollow communicator activated. The human ambassador appeared again. Still calm. Still measured. You expected war. A pause. You never considered what happens when we don't see you as an enemy anymore. Only a problem to be solved. The warlord stiffened. Your species is no longer a military opponent. You are now a failed state, and we do not wage war against failed states, we eliminate the variables. Another pause. Your supply routes are gone. Your commanders are dead. Your strongholds are already compromised. The only decision left is how you wish to die. And then, just before the feed cut, the ambassador smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was not a diplomatic smile. It was the smile of a species that had learned through centuries of war and blood that sometimes the best way to win was to erase the game entirely. The end of the Vashon Dominion. The war was over in 9 days. The Vashon leadership surrendered unconditionally. The few surviving warlords were tried for crimes against sentient species, and the Vashon name, the once feared empire of raiders, became a historical footnote, a lesson in what happens when you mistake humanity's patience for weakness. Epilogue: A changed galaxy. On a quiet diplomatic station, High Commander Vex met with the human ambassador one last time. "You didn't just destroy them," she said, voice unreadable. "You made them irrelevant." The human sipped a cup of tea, a habit Vex still found oddly quaint. "Violence," the human said, "is an inefficient problem-solving tool." Vex stared at them. "Inefficient? You wiped an entire empire off the map." The human tilted their head. "We didn't wipe them out," they corrected. "We just removed their capacity to matter." The silence stretched between them. Finally, Vex spoke the thought that had been haunting her since Centauri Prime. "You humans, you don't just fight wars, do you?" The human smiled again. "No," they admitted. "We end them." Final transmission to the galaxy fire. 2 days later, an anonymous broadcast echoed across every major communication hub in the Confederacy. It contained a single message: galactic notice. Humanity does not negotiate with terrorists. We do not tolerate hostage-taking. We do not accept threats. A pause. If you choose to test this, understand one thing. We will not fight you. We will calculate you out of existence. The transmission ended. And for the first time in the history of the galaxy, the stars themselves seemed to hold their breath.